slipped away.
Those of you who are catechumens or the elect and the candidates and all of us present here, perhaps this is very well known to us now that Catholicism in the United States is at a very critical juncture at the moment. Just as an example, 20 years back, actually 23 years back, when I first came to this parish, we used to have the Rite of Election, which many of you participated on the very first Sunday of Lent. And we used to have 2 sessions in English here at Immaculate Conception Church, because it's a huge place. And there were 2 sessions at the Cathedral in Cincinnati. And both of those used to be filled, standing room only. We would only invite the candidates, the catechumens, and their sponsors, and immediate family members. Fast forward 23 years later. And did I mention that there were 2 sessions each, one at 3:30 and 7 o'clock over here, and 3:30 and 7 o'clock at the Cathedral. So 4 sessions altogether for the entire Archdiocese. And there was standing room only. Fast forward 23 years. We had 2 sessions in English. One in Cincinnati, one in Dayton. And not even those were full. We had 2 other sessions, and they were in Spanish. So 23 years, as I look back, it's truly shocking for me and indeed tragic. And yet, here you and I are in church today, continuing to be Catholics in these very complicated times. We still will have about 40 people coming to church in our parish, and today we have a baptism. There are parents who still are putting their faith in the church. So on one side there is hope. On the other side lies challenges. So it is in this context, I believe, that the story of the Samaritan woman invites us to reflect on our faith, both in Christ and in the church. So I'm going to use the story of the Samaritan woman to share 3 points here for us to reflect upon during this week. I'm calling my first point, trading the jar for the spring. Trading the jar for the spring. The Samaritan woman reminds me of me. I think of how she came to the well with a jar. Now a jar can hold only so much water, and at some point the water in a jar will become stale. But a spring or a well is refreshed by an ever-flowing spring. The story of the Samaritan woman is about a God who's like a well, and to whom we come with our little jars. Often we hold on to the jar as if it's the well. We read a similar story in today's first reading. When the Israelites got thirsty in the desert, they lost sight of what God had done in the past and the future into which God was leading them. They lost sight. And that's what I mean by sometimes we come before God holding on to the jar and thinking that the jar is it. But we forget that God is the well. The people in the desert forgot that God was the well that could quench every thirst. And sometimes we make God as small as the jars we carry. But God offers us so much more. Jesus' words to the Samaritan woman are very relevant today. Jesus said, if you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. God doesn't just fill our jars, but rather God opens a spring within us. And this is exactly what Paul means when he says in today's second reading, the love of God has been poured into our hearts. The love of God has been poured into our hearts. So folks, today, whatever this means to you, take this home with you. Let's drop our jars and let's allow Christ to pour God's love into our hearts and open the spring of living water within us. Secondly, I want to talk about faith, because I began my homily asking, what does faith mean in Christ and what does faith mean in the church? In the final analysis, the story of the Samaritan woman is a story of a faith encounter. It's the story of a woman, and I'm saying this emphatically because of the times in which this encounter took place. It was a woman outside the Jewish tradition who had a face-to-face encounter with Jesus, a man who is the Messiah. Now, even though at the beginning of the story, the woman did not know who Jesus was, at the end of the story, she came to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And John concludes the story with the words, many of the Samaritans of that town began to believe in him because of the word of the woman who testified, he told me everything I have done. And so John's point is, the Samaritan woman believed, and because of her faith, an entire town came to believe. So this coming to faith in Jesus Christ is the point of John's story. Well, the story is a truly well-constructed story. The Samaritan woman engages Jesus on many levels before she came to have faith in him as the Messiah. She engages him on a sociological level. How can a Jew talk to a Samaritan? So he's talking to them on a sociological level, on an intellectual level, on the doctrinal differences between the Samaritans and the Jews. And she even tried to evade some uncomfortable details about her private life. It's a fabulous story. However, all these things recede to the background once she realized the significance of the moment. All the arguments that she was making, she has to let them go. Because once she recognized Christ, every other thing moved to the periphery. The story of the Samaritan woman makes me reflect on my own faith. What does it mean to have faith in Jesus Christ? Of course, we can reflect on religion as a sociological phenomenon, like the Samaritan woman was doing, as a theological pursuit, as a doctrinal endeavor, or as a ritual practice. And I'm not saying that intellectually reasoning our beliefs, our doctrines and rituals are not important. But at the core of it all lies something very simple and basic. Standing face to face with Jesus, the Messiah. at the core of our faith. Catholicism is so rich in its history and doctrine and beauty, and the rituals are. But at the core of it all is something very basic and simple: standing face to face with Jesus, the Messiah. Faith and religion, first and foremost, is about standing face to face with Christ. When faith and religion is about what we can get out of it, then we are like the Samaritan woman who came to the well with a jar, a small jar. When faith is primarily about our intellect, our doctrines, and our rituals, faith is something. But once we stand face to face with Christ, then faith becomes somebody. There's a difference between the two. Faith as something and faith as somebody. Once we meet Christ, the sacraments and our worship are not something we do, but somebody we meet. Once faith emerges from a face-to-face encounter with Jesus, then religion and theology and doctrines and rituals and daily prayer take on a whole new meaning. So I'm inviting you to take time this week to reflect on the meaning of faith and belief for you. What is faith? What is religion? What does it mean for you to believe? And finally, I want to talk about faith as a conversation. Perhaps you are as conscious as I am about the very socially and politically contentious times we live in today. And sadly, religion is woven into these contentions. Most of these very difficult conversations happening is religion is intricately being involved. People are becoming more and more intolerant, disrespectful, hateful, and violent about their politics and also their faith. As a result, the fastest growing segment of believers in the United States is called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. And that's why you see an empty church for the Rite of Election. Because people are saying no to a certain kind of organized religion. People who are spiritually without identifying themselves as religious or declaring allegiance to any religious tradition. Now, the fact that in the biblical times, when religious wars were rampant, a man and a woman, an outsider and an insider, a Jew and a Samaritan could have a face-to-face conversation about society, politics, and religion and faith is very relevant to me today. This story is very relevant to me today. Now think about it. A man and a woman, an outsider and insider, a Jew and a Samaritan have a very interesting conversation about society and politics and religion and faith. Jesus, though he was the Son of God, did not compel or threaten the Samaritan woman. She was honest. She really was honest with her views, and Jesus merely offered her possibilities. Even after the Samaritan woman came to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, her testimony to her town folks was very impressive. She merely said, "Come and meet the man who told me everything I have done." She did not condemn, she did not compel, she did not argue. She merely said, "Come and meet the man who has told me everything that I have done." Perhaps our faith that stems from our face-to-face encounter with Christ is such that it leads to only honest, respectful, loving, and caring conversations with people. Folks, may our faith never lead us to intolerance, to disrespect, to hate, to violence. May our testimony never compel, but always and only point to Christ, the one who is called the Christ. As Christ comes to us in this Eucharist, really, we will be standing face to face with the same Messiah who stood face to face with the Samaritan woman. Let us allow Christ to touch the very core of our being. May the mercy and love of God transform us forever. And may there be a well that springs from deep within us. And really, may that be our story. People of God said,